Luke 19 will be in the first 10 verses. Greg, you mind closing that door for me? Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. It's good to see you all this morning. Good to have Mike and Rebecca back, and hoping that we'll see some better attendance in church, where they're just the 8 o'clock service is mandated on the masks, and after that it's optional for the other services. We've had, believe it or not, we've had quite a few people leave the church over not the Cross Point and other churches have not been requiring a mask. We've lost some people because of it. So hoping that we'll see some people back today. And
we finally got her. We're vaccinated now. So.
You ready to go, huh? Which one did y'all get?
I'm sorry.
Which one did you get?
Moderna.
Okay. Isn't that the good one? The Johnson & Johnson's obviously having a lot of problems. They quit. Matter of fact, they've quit giving it out in some places.
Yeah.
So,
It was
a batch.
Yeah.
We had a niece have a little problem.
Yeah. So anyway, hopefully we'll have a good crowd down there in the worship service today. Well, this past week, I have this one extra book that I ordered through Lifeway. It's a commentary that I enjoy. Steve got to read it, and it just adds a different perspective to our lesson. I enjoy it. The writer of this does a really good job. And he always puts little things in. He gives a little devotion at the beginning of the week that kind of gets you started off the week, getting your mind set on things. And this week he mentioned the word triage in his devotion. How would you define the word triage? What is triage to you?
I think of medical, and you're handling lots of people, and you've got to decide who goes first.
There you go. That's priority. Remember watching MASH? And that was a word that was used, I think, in MASH, where, they'd get all these people coming in and they had to make a decision on priorities of who was going to get attention. The actual definition of triage is the sorting and allocation of treatment to patients, especially battle and disaster victims, according to a system of priorities designed to maximize the number of survivors. So when he said that word, that kind of got me, I love to chase rabbits. I never catch any rabbits, but I'm good at chasing them. And I can run fast. I just not fast enough to ever catch anything. But I did a little word look up on the history of the word triage, because I had a feeling there was more to it than just what we know it as. And come to find out that it's really evolved over the last 250 years, last 300 years. Its original definition means to categorize. To categorize. It really didn't have a medical connotation. That came from Napoleon Bonaparte. Is that how you say it, Bonaparte? When he was in conquest, expanding his borders, so to speak, and taking other lands or whatever. And in the late 1780s, he found himself in a situation where he was in the Middle East, and he found himself blocked in by a British blockade, where they basically cut off his supply chain, and he couldn't get food and just basic commodities that he needed, and including medicine, which was something he desperately needed. And in one particular battle near the Mediterranean, he lost almost 1/5 of his army. And because of a severe shortage of medical supplies and other necessities, he used this practice of using the term triage, where he had to basically categorize. And and in triage today, they actually have like 5 different levels that they assign. And so that's how it really got its usage today, as in being in a medical term, more of a medical term. But, I got to thinking this week, I wonder if we could all be guilty at some point of spiritual triage, of assigning categories to people that we think are more reachable than others. I think that we all probably have been guilty of that at some point in time, of spiritual triage, thinking some people are worth the fight. You know what I'm saying? Whereas in the medical field, we say, well, they worth the investment. Because, obviously, if you're down to a certain percentage of men, you like, well, which ones have the better chance of being useful to me in war? So they're the ones worth investing to. putting medical attention to. And spiritually, I think we can find ourselves in that mindset, so to speak, and thinking that certain people are not reachable. And today's story is a good example of people who thought a particular man was not worth investing into. That's the story of Zacchaeus. So let's read the first 10 verses of Luke 19. It says in verse 1, and Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was chief among the publicans, yours probably says tax collectors, and he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was, and he could not for the crowd, because he was little of stature. And he ran before, and he climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste, come down, for today I must abide at your house. And he made haste and came down and received him, that is Jesus, joyfully. And when they, this is the people, saw it, they all murmured, saying, he is gone to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, behold, Lord, half the goods I will give to the poor. And if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I will restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, this day is salvation come to this house, for as much as he is also the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and save that which was lost. It's a good story, isn't it? We're familiar with this story, but hoping today we can kind of approach it from a different perspective. Anything we need to lift up to the Lord this morning as we go into prayer? Any update on that?
She's finished her radiation and chemo a couple weeks now. She's down to 100 pounds, so she's in a dangerous category. So she's had a feeding tube because she can't swallow. So now we've got a machine that feed her all night. So we pray for her to get some weight back on.
Is she mobile?
She walks very slow, but she can walk around.
So she has to have help with a lot of things that she wouldn't normally have to have help with, bathing and things, or not?
No, she's not married.
Okay.
She can still bathe.
Okay.
Need someone to be with her while that is. Amy does take her out. She wants to fly.
You'll have a lot of those around your house?
Around her house, yeah.
Whose house are we talking about?
Amy's mom.
Oh, I thought she lived with y'all.
Oh, no, she only lived with us when her house was over there.
I didn't realize that.
4 months.
Okay, I was unaware of that. Okay. Does she live close to y'all?
In Chalkville, so about 15 minutes.
Okay. All right. Well, Miss Joy, we miss her. I know what's going on with her.
Every day it's a little different. He seems to be hanging in there, but he has his problems. He's still having a lot of seizures. They keep him on medicine, and when he takes those, he just basically a limp noodle.
Okay.
It's pretty rough.
Speaking of my dad, he's on. Dad, your mic is on. That's how I knew you were here.
Yeah. Remember to pray for Jennifer. She's having a lot of pain in her shoulder.
Okay. Let me hook up the sound bar here 1 second so we can hear you. We were just talking about you. Someone mentioned that they hadn't seen you in a while on here.
Well, we went to church a couple of Sundays. The reason I wanted to mention some of your sister Jennifer is having a lot of shoulder pain.
Okay.
So remember to pray for her. She really needs to go to the doctor, but she hasn't gone yet.
All right. Appreciate that. I'll touch bases with her this week. I haven't heard from her in a while, so that would, I even sent her some little political thing and she didn't respond, which is unusual. She's she political stuff. So anyway, all right. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer before we get into our text this morning. And yes, sir.
One other thing, I've got he's a great nephew, I guess you'd say. But, a lot of, drugs has touched almost every family, but he needs the Lord. And before he, and actually, I got another great niece too. I think they experiment. Well, I know they are. But before they go too far, y'all just pray for them. They need the Lord.
Yeah, and Steve knows something about that too, and that's a road that's a tough road. It really is to watch that, especially with somebody you love.
That one nephew missed out on a great job opportunity this past week.
Yeah, every choice has a consequence, doesn't it?
Yes.
All right, well, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we do lift up these needs to you, especially this nephew and niece, Father, and even Steve's son, God. We intercede for them right now. Holy Spirit, we pray you do a work in their life that only you can do. And our story today is evidence that you still do work like this. It's not just something you did, you still do. And it's easy for us to get into a place where we can give up on folks that you just don't give up on. Thank you for this story today that reminds us of that. And may it motivate us as we live our Christian lives out this week to not give up on folks and not categorize them, not be guilty of spiritual triage. So bless our time in your word this morning. We ask this in your name. Amen. So the setting here that we have in Luke 19, you'll recall last week, we fast forwarded a whole bunch. We went to the end of the chapter, Luke, and went to the resurrection. So this week we're rewinding and going back where we left off a couple of weeks ago. And if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I told you that Jesus is on a trip. He's on the last trip that he'll ever take. This is a trip that he's taken over 30 different times, 33 times at least. And he's making his way to Jerusalem. As a child, he took this trip with his parents to the temple. So he's familiar with this trip. It's an annual trip. But this is different because he knows that not only is it his last trip, but he knows what is at the end of it. We fast forwarded last week and we remember that he's on a colt and then he's making his way to eventually to the cross. And we will get into that into these upcoming weeks. But this is a trip that, culminates where he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's praying and sweating blood. There's a lot of stress, a lot of mental, emotional stress. This shows the physical humanity of Jesus as a man. And as you recall, that if you look at a map, you see that the Jericho is actually north of Jerusalem, but it says he's going up. That's because he's going up in elevation. So if you look on the map, you'll see that Jericho is slightly to the east and slightly to the north of Jerusalem. But today we find in our story that he's in Jericho. He's in this town called Jericho. And in verse 1, it says that Jesus entered and he passed through Jericho. So he's not spending a lot of time there, but he does spend some time there, as our story tells us this morning. Over these last weeks and months that we've been in Luke, we've had the luxury of talking about different parables and events that happened in Jesus' 33-and-a-half-year ministry that were told in other gospels. So we had, it's for me as a teacher, it's an extra benefit when I have a text that is in Matthew's account or in Mark's account or John's account, because I get perspective that maybe Luke doesn't give me. Although I have to say that over these last months, I have to say I'm almost going to pick Luke as my favorite gospel. It's really, really good. I have had a much greater appreciation for the content and detail that Luke has given us. But all that said, today's story is exclusive to Luke. John, Matthew, or Mark don't mention this story of Zacchaeus. Only Luke. So we only have what he gives us of this account. And by the way, I'm extremely thankful that he gave us this story. For whatever reason, he was led by Holy Spirit to to write this down and give this to the reader. So as we see in verse 3, there's a large crowd following Jesus. So you have this mental picture of Jesus making this journey to Jerusalem, but everywhere he goes, there's a large multitude with him. So as he's traveling, people are coming out, and I don't know if at a certain point, he's losing crowd members. As he gets to a certain point, people go back to their home, but he's gaining new people as he enters the city limits of these different little towns and places that he goes. So the crowd is never reduced. It's always large. It may be different. It may be assimilating with different people coming into the crowds, but the crowd no less is always large as he comes into and is passing through Jericho. And in verse 2, as he's coming through Jericho, it says, behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. And the Authorized says was chief among the publicans, but your translation more than likely says tax collector, does it probably say that? That's because it was a tax collector. The original Greek word, which is pronounced architalones, for the chief publican, is actually a tax collector. So that's why most translations, contemporary translations, say tax collector. By the way, it's no coincidence that we're talking about Jericho and tax collecting. They're synonymous. That's because there were 3 major tax collection centers in ancient Palestine, which would include Judah and Israel. The first one was not the first one, but one of them was in Capernaum. If you look at a Bible map, that is up north. The second one is in Caesarea, which is on the left coast, the west coast, which is a port on the Sea of Galilee. It would make sense why that would be there. And then you have the one in the south that's in Jericho. So it makes sense that you have Zacchaeus being a tax collector in Jericho, because that's a major tax collection center. The other thing that's interesting here is that you notice that he's chief tax collector. So he's not just a tax collector. By the way, have any of you watched that new series called The Chosen? That is, I gotta admit, I am so far really impressed with that particular show. It is the most well done, as best I can tell, accurate, what is the word I'm looking for? Depiction of the life of Jesus. But what it does is it adds a lot of stuff that is not in the Bible. But when I say that, it's not adding things with theology wise, it's just adding events that would have happened in its day and time. And like, for instance, it's focusing on Matthew, the tax collector. And it really just does an exceptional, first of all, the Matthew's young in this depiction of him, which makes sense when you think about the disciples that Jesus was picking. It's showing a lot of the disciples that were living their lives before Jesus asks or says, follow me. And so I'm watching it on Peacock. But you can go, there's an app called, on your phone, if you click in The Chosen, it'll come up. You can watch it for, yes, sir.
Are you familiar with who produced that?
Yes, I am. One second, Dad. I'm sorry, Steve.
All the different.
Yes.
And The Chosen shows how
It
that
does.
came to be. But you multiply that by a lot of different examples. But yeah, watch season 1. You can watch, binge watch it if you want. And the first episode was last week, I think.
Of season 2 is coming out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So tonight is the second episode. I think there's like 6 or 7 episodes.
Yes.
And they're taking in money, donations that eventually end up, I think, with 6 seasons. Obviously, we're going to get to the crucifixion part, which, to me, Jesus knew that was always coming.
Right.
You mentioned his last trip down to Jerusalem.
Right.
How could he maintain his composure, his humor, his compassion, knowing what was coming? anyway, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, they're using crowdfunding to source it. And I'm Dad, if you wanted to say something on that, I'll let you, but there they are. Crowdfunding is a great way of funding it. So they're not relying on any kind of entity. It's not through any particular denomination, although I have looked at some of the people behind it that use a Catholic priest and some other people that are giving the historical context to it. So, I mean, they're, you know, you may feel odd about that. It depends on what you think. But as best I can tell, it's been pretty accurate. And the crowdfunding is a great way to fund it. So I watched a live event through Angel Productions. If you know who VidAngel is, which is a filtering service like ClearPlay that filters content. So when you're watching a movie, it filters out. We use this as with our kids growing up. But it's VidAngel was sold, but this is another production company called Angel Productions. And they actually, I watched a live event where they're raising money. They have a lot of different series, like Dry Bar Comedy is something they do, where it's clean comedy. They have multiple shows that are out there, and they are getting exceptionally high ratings. Critics love it. Even Rotten Tomatoes gives The Chosen 100%. Matter of fact, Disney was in a big lawsuit with this particular company and tried to shut them down 3 separate times. Which is ironic. They released the downloads, and guess who's on top of Disney Plus for downloads? Angel Productions, right on top of Disney. It's the irony of it's beautiful. So they are now like one of the top downloaded. It's incredible. This company is really doing an exceptional job, and they're coming out with a whole bunch more programming. They have very little experience in this type of background, but it's well done. Dad, were you wanting to say something on that?
Yes, I started getting a lot of information on The Chosen, the series, and because of my ministry background, they asked that I help promote it. So I started to do a lot of investigating into it, and I found out that the founders of the Angel, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The Angel that you're talking about, that I've been familiar with for a long time, founded by 2 Mormon men. And The Chosen is backed by these same Mormon men, and they were sued by Disney and a couple of other companies because they were editing out certain words from the movies, and they've been in a long battle. I mean, you can get it on the internet. You can just Google it. Might take you a little bit because I think they're trying to hide who's behind The Chosen. But they're going to use it, I'm sure, as a evangelism tool to bring people into the Mormon church. But it may be done very well. I haven't seen anything but just snippets of it, whatever. I didn't know it was available on Peacock. But just be aware that it is has strong Mormon influence in it.
Okay.
They make it Brigham Young.
Yeah, I noticed it's on Brigham Young's station.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Obviously because of it.
Yeah.
But everything I've seen so far.
Yeah, and I am watching it with skepticism. Trust me, I am. I anytime I see anything like that, I am. But so far, I love what I've seen it. Anyway, I'm sorry to digress. Let me get back to this lesson because, so anyway, Zacchaeus here, it appears he's not just a tax collector, he's a chief tax collector, which meant that he was probably a tax collector, much like Matthew was, where he was going door to door or people that were coming into town. He was going to individuals and collecting taxes, but now he's an overseer of multiple tax collectors. So he holds a rather lofty position. He was a man that the Bible indicates here in verse 2 that he's very rich. It was a job that was, you were compensated well for the job by the Romans, but you also were compensated well because you received commissions on what you collected. Not only that, but there were so many taxes from the Romans in those days. There was a tax on everything. It was almost a tax to breathe, literally. So they could charge what they wanted, and you really didn't know what the tax rate was. There was some tax rates that were fixed. There were others that were variable. So you really didn't know what the tax was, and you weren't going to question. You just paid the tax. So all this led to Zacchaeus being a very wealthy man. By the way, I mean, if you were going to have this kind of job, it came with a price. There was a payoff for being a tax collector. Because if you're a tax collector, you know going into it that you're going to be a man that's not well loved. You're going to be faced with contempt. When people saw you in and about, and no doubt Zacchaeus was a man who was well known. He'd been doing this for a while, even though he was a chief tax collector. People still knew who he was. They knew him from remembering him collecting taxes. And, you know, you had to be comfortable within your skin to know that you're not liked and deal with it. There was a payoff. Yes, you're going to be wealthy, but it came at a price. Add to this that he's a Jew. Zacchaeus is a Jewish name. He's a Jew, but he's collecting for the Roman government. And so he wouldn't have been popular with his own people. He would have been seen as a traitor. This is a man that's collecting money to give to the enemy. And this is one of the things that the Jewish people were hoping Jesus would be, is not only a Messiah, but a Messiah that would deliver them from the Roman rule. One of the things they were very, very disappointed in is to realize that that's not what he had came for. He was a different type of king. So no self-respecting Jew wanted anything to do with a tax collector. And that's the kind of life that Zacchaeus had to deal with. He was living a life where his own people wanted nothing to do with him. He wasn't even allowed in the synagogue. I've even read some things, I don't know how true it is, that he couldn't even testify in a court because his word was not considered honest enough to be in court. So as we read here, it says that he was little in stature. Now, of course, there's two different types of stature, and I'll get to the other one here in a minute. But the first type of stature is regarding his actual size, his height. The average height for a man was a little over 5 foot, the Jewish man for that day and time. So he's probably less than 5 foot. He's in the 4 foot range. He's a short guy. And perhaps, you know, I thought this week as I was reading this, perhaps that's one of the reasons he chose to be a tax collector. At some point, he quit growing, and it probably caused some angst in his life. We have a coworker at work. He's a short fella, and he gets a lot of grief. He makes fun of it too. He's used to it. He's had to deal with it for the majority of his adult life. Always make fun that we can't tell if he's driving the truck or not. I mean, you know, he's in there, but he's really hard to see. And so this man Zacchaeus no doubt had probably dealt with that, and maybe it created some social awkward situations for him that he had adapted to. And so he figured, you know, if I'm already kind of a social outcast as it is, I might as well be rich and be a social outcast. And so maybe that's one of the reasons he chose to be a tax collector. Who knows? But this is the man we see, and this is the man who we have here in verse 3. And it says in verse 3, and he sought to see Jesus, who he was, and he could not for the press or the crowd, because he was little of stature. You know, the other thing that struck me about Zacchaeus' height this week is that when I got to thinking about it, you know, here's a little guy that's going around to people a lot taller than him, a lot bigger than him, and saying, give me taxes. And I would imagine at first that had to have been a little bit of a little imposing for him. Y'all remember that Andy Griffith episode where Barney is dealing with this guy that's selling fruit out of his truck, and the dude is kind of big, and he's rather imposing, and he looks down at Barney. You know, Barney's not short, but he's not much to him. You know, he has to jump around in the shower to get wet, and he this guy kind of looks at Barney like, who do you think you are? Just because you got on a uniform doesn't mean anything, and kind of just runs roughshod over him. And the episode kind of shows where over a period of days, Barney keeps trying to come back and force the issue that you're not supposed to be, you don't have a license to sell this fruit and you don't need to be doing this. And at some point it comes to a head where Barney realizes that he's got to stand up, put up or shut up. And he realizes that it's his badge. It's his badge where the power is. It's not in his stature of who he was. It's the powers behind the badge. And behind that badge is power much bigger than Barney. And so it is with Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus probably had to come to that moment where, just because he's 4'8" or 4'6" or whatever he is, when he's looking up these people telling him what they're going to give in taxes, the people realize it's not Zacchaeus that's the power. It's the power behind Zacchaeus, the badge, so to speak, the Roman government. Because if they didn't pay their taxes, there's going to be a big Roman soldier that's about 6'4" or 250 pounds that's all decked out that's going to impose the will upon you. And so, you know, I would imagine that maybe Zacchaeus had to deal with that at some point when he was just getting into tax collecting. But it says here, the words in verse 3 says, and he sought to see Jesus, who he was. That particular phrase, and he sought to see Jesus, who he was, is really, it's open to interpretation, because we don't know, you know, what the level of interest was. I mean, it could be anywhere. I don't think this is the case, but some have said maybe it could just be that he just happened to see a crowd and wondering who it is the crowd's seeking. Who are they following? Who is this? But I think it was much more than that. And I think the passage kind of gives us an indication that he was aware of who Jesus was prior to this moment. It wasn't a spontaneous thing where he sees Jesus or sees a crowd and wonders who it is that they're all clamoring to see. He knew of Jesus. Zacchaeus would have been a man who was up on the news, up on current events. He probably traveled. You know, he was aware of what was going on in his world because he was collecting taxes from everybody. So he knew more than most. So he knew of Jesus. What he knew, I don't know. But it appears that his interest in Jesus was more than just what this crowd was interested in.
I think you get the feeling there was a spiritual hunger there.
I do too.
He may have been rich, but he wasn't satisfied.
Exactly. Yeah, that's good. I agree. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's real good. But this was not uncommon in the ministry of Jesus. As we've read over these last months, there's a lot of people that took interest in Jesus for multiple reasons. Some were superficial reasons. You know, some really probably were just following him just because who he was, and he's the popular guy, and he, you know, he's got a lot of likes on Facebook. You know, I mean, you want to see who he is. But there were others that really needed healing. There were others that were interested in Jesus for spiritual reasons. Some came to him in secret, as we did see with Nicodemus. By the way, Nicodemus is another man that's focusing on the chosen in an interesting way that shows some things about him. But the issue here is that we see in verse 3 that even though Zacchaeus had an interest in Jesus, he could not get to Jesus for the crowd. And this still happens today too. There are people that are interested in Jesus, but there are things that discourage them. I don't mean to offend anybody by saying this. If you think that we should wear masks, that's fine. But I was talking to my brother this week, who is a Centos man and was servicing a church this past week, and they were talking about Easter Sunday. Somehow the conversation came up where a visitor came to their church and asked if he had to wear a mask, and they said yes, and he left. And I thought, my goodness, shame on that church, man. I mean, come on, man. I mean, seriously, the man had an interest in something spiritual. Overlook your physical, you know, vulnerability for a minute and let a man in. I mean, who knows if he went to another church? I mean, what's going on in that man's life? He had a spiritual interest in Jesus at that moment. Shame on that church. I'm just going to say it. Shame on them. And you know, there are people like Zacchaeus here who have an interest in Jesus, but there are certain things that sometimes happen. And sometimes I think we are involved in that. We are involved in activities that discourage people from Jesus. And shame on us if we are someone that discourages and are in the crowd and elbowing and punching and not letting somebody get to Jesus that has an interest into him. You know, and that's where Zacchaeus is in this moment. But, you know, thank goodness in this case, Zacchaeus really didn't care. He wasn't going to let it deter him. He wanted to see this man, Jesus, for whatever reason he wanted to see him, and he was going to do something about it. And in verse 4, we see what he did. And in verse 4, it says, and he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him. For Jesus was to pass that way. I would love to see a video of this right here. I really would, because, you know, as you know, short little people have to move a little quicker than most. And legs have to get going. You know, they have short legs and they have to move a little faster than the average person. And he's trying to get ahead of the crowd. The crowd is moving, so he just comes up with this plan. And he's like, well, I'm going to get ahead of the crowd and see if I can find a place where strategically I can get myself in a place. I don't know if he had thought that a tree would be a good idea, but perhaps there were a lot of trees along the route. So he thought that was a good idea. So he runs ahead, finding for the best view to get ahead of Jesus. So I would imagine he has to, he feels like he needs to get a good, maybe a half a mile ahead or a quarter of a mile ahead to buy some time to set himself up logistically, to position himself so he has time to be ready for Jesus when the crowd comes. So he spots this sycamore tree, which is, your Bible might say fig tree. It's more commonly probably what it was. It's a type of tree that has a low trunk, which means it has branches that are low to the ground for a short guy. So it had a lot of branches so that the branches aren't far apart so that he can reach the next branch, but yet the branches had enough strength so that it could support him. And this particular tree would also have a lot of leaves. And so he would be able to kind of like be a little, what's the word I'm looking for here? Camouflaged, I guess. Yeah, he could kind of hide himself in the tree and see Jesus, but no one could see him. And this is an interesting picture because Zacchaeus is a prominent man. If you know much about running with Jewish people, that wasn't something they did a lot of. It wasn't, especially prominent people. They didn't do running. You can look this up for yourself. There's some reasons why. That's an interesting study you can do on your own. But you wouldn't typically see a prominent man like this running. It was out of character to see a man who was so-called white collar running and just trying to get somewhere like this. And you definitely wouldn't see him climbing a tree. But he is aware of the fact that he's running ahead of the crowd, so no one's going to see him. He's leaving the people behind, so he's running, he's isolated, and he's getting up into this tree. And so as he climbs up into this tree, he's probably making sure that he can find just the right view. He sees the crowd coming, can hear them coming. He's trying to find this perfect height to get up into the tree where he can, it's not unsafe, but he can position himself where he's comfortable, because we don't know how long he thinks he's going to be in this tree. So he gets up in here to this tree, and he's found the right limb where he can kind of brace himself, not be dangerous, has good footing, and now he can wait for the crowd to come. Do you have the picture? This is Zacchaeus waiting for the crowd. And as they're approaching, verse 5 says, and when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said unto him, and we'll get to what he says in a minute, but I have this picture now. Here he is. The crowd is coming. He can hear him. He can see him. That Jesus is coming, and he's expecting. I don't know. I don't really know what he's expecting, honestly. I just know he's wanting to get a good view of Jesus. What exactly it is he's expecting, I'm not sure of. Sometimes you just want to see somebody. I was telling Greg earlier, I stumbled on this Christian radio station locally that's in Birmingham. It's an odd station, to be honest with you. I never even knew it was on the dial. It's on 93.3, and they play these clips of a Chinese man named Witness Lee. I'd never heard of Witness Lee. He was associated with a man named Watchman Nee. They're Chinese, and Witness Lee came to the United States back in the 40s and started a ministry called Living Waters Ministry, I think it's called. And anyway, they're playing clips of this man, and I'm like, who is this guy? I had to go get on the internet and find out who he is. Turns out there's a lot about him on the internet. And so that interest here is what, I see from Zacchaeus. He wants to see what he's heard about. There's that interest of seeing Jesus. But whatever it was he expected, it wasn't what happened. Because I think he's kind of like trying to be inconspicuous into this tree, not expecting Jesus to notice him. But it's like, he's just thinking that he's above Jesus, and Jesus is more preoccupied with the crowd, but Jesus isn't. Jesus knows that Zacchaeus is in this tree, and can you imagine the kind of the heart-stopping moment when all of a sudden Jesus looks right up at him, and Zacchaeus knows that Jesus is looking at him? It's that, whoa, like I wasn't expecting that. Add to that Jesus says, hey, Zacchaeus. He mentions him by name. And Jesus had a habit of doing this. We would call it Nathaniel. Jesus did this. Jesus knew people by their names. And so it had to have been just kind of a pulsating moment here where Zacchaeus is kind of caught off guard. What's interesting past this is that, you know, nobody had an interest in Zacchaeus. None of the crowd had an interest in Zacchaeus, but Jesus did. The crowd couldn't care less about about Zacchaeus. He was not a man worth investing into. They knew his past. But Jesus knew his past too. And Jesus looked past the past, if you will. Sorry for that repetitiveness there. But Jesus, how else can I say that? Jesus looked past the reputation of Zacchaeus for what he was and had an interest in him. Because Jesus wasn't interested in the past of Zacchaeus. Jesus was interested in the future of Zacchaeus. The people, all they cared about was the past of Zacchaeus, what he had done. And Jesus didn't care less about that. Jesus was interested in his future. And yes, sir.
And we all, I mean, I've been guilty of it too, I guess, that you see people that live that rough life, that come to Jesus, people can't get past, like you said, the past.
Exactly.
And it's wrong. You know, they're dealing with that in themselves.
Have you noticed, though, that's who Jesus gravitated towards? And specifically, Jesus, or more specifically, excuse me, Jesus really had a thing for tax collectors. He really had a thing for tax collectors. Just in the book of Luke alone, let me just give you a couple examples. Luke chapter 3, verse 12. Tax collectors come to Jesus to be baptized. Luke 5:29, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining with them and with Jesus at the table. Luke 7:29, when all the people heard this, and the tax collectors too, they declared God just, having been baptized with the baptism of John. Luke 15:1, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. Of course, we know Matthew, as other accounts in the New Testament of tax collectors. Matthew is a tax collector. Jesus calls him to follow him. Jesus loved tax collectors. But that's just an example of the type people Jesus called. Jesus came to the shepherds, the outcast, at the very first, the announcements given to them. Jesus always came to the ones that the public always ignored. The religious leaders always ignored. They played spiritual triage. They ignored a certain segment of society. We recall in the Good Samaritan that we talked about in these last weeks, the priest overlooks someone, but that's who Jesus is, the Good Samaritan, gives his attention to. And he loved tax collectors. And of course, we have the tax collector here in Luke 19. Jesus has always loved the unlovable and still does. I love the next words of Jesus where he tells Zacchaeus, he says, Zacchaeus, make haste. Come down, for today I must abide at your house. I love that little word that we sometimes ignore there. He says, for today I must abide at your house. It's almost like, well, we got to be careful with that. Some people want to say that can almost be the doctrine of election, where, you know, God chose him to be saved. And I don't buy that at all. But he's saying this is a divine appointment. This is no accident. And I think all of us have divine appointments, and people, we've come to know Christ. I believe when I was 5 years old, the divine appointment that I had on the couch in St. Louis, Missouri, where my mother led me to Christ, was a divine appointment. And some people choose to accept the divine appointment and some don't. And I think a lot of people have had an opportunity for a divine appointment, but they didn't obey. So Jesus gives Zacchaeus, he says, make haste and come down, for today I must abide. But if you look in verse 6, he says, and he did make haste and came down and received him. So in other words, it's not a mandate. Zacchaeus still had to receive him. So he still had a choice in the matter, just as we did in the Garden of Eden with 2 trees. We've always had a choice. But I love verse 6. He says, and he made haste. I can just see this picture of Zacchaeus coming down on this tree quickly, you know. I mean, he's excited. He had went up in this tree just to get a glimpse of Jesus. He didn't expect Jesus to like look right at him and then say his name and then say not only that, but say, hey, today I must come to your house. He woke up that morning with an expectation of the way the day was going to go, but this was not how it went. And that's the way it is a lot of times with people who come to know Christ. Most people that accept Christ don't wake up saying, this is the day I'm going to accept Christ. It's something that happens. Holy Spirit does his work, and you accept Christ, and your day and your life is different from that moment on. And Zacchaeus here, he is extremely excited. Made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But the crowd isn't very happy about it. And when that's the crowd, saw it, they all murmured, saying, so in other words, people are asking, where did he go? There's this crowd outside, and all of a sudden Jesus is gone. These people are pressing to see Jesus, and as people that are in the back finally get up to the front, they realize, where is he? No, like, he's gone to be with a man that's a sinner. Like, can you believe that? I mean, here we all are. We've been following him. Here we are. Like, why would he leave us? Where does he go? He goes, he's with a tax collector. Can you believe the audacity of all people? He's with a tax collector, really? That's the way they say it. That's the murmuring that you hear here. This is the equivalent of spiritual triage. They're categorizing who they think Jesus should be interested in. In other words, they think they're better than this sinner. They're better than this tax collector. And why would Jesus waste his time on a tax collector of all people, a traitor, a dishonest man, a man that's not even allowed in the synagogue? No self-respecting Jew would even dare have a man like a tax collector to his house for supper, and let alone go to his house. And that's where Jesus goes? Don't you think this still happens today? Why is it that we think there are some people who will never come to Jesus? And we do too. I admit it. I do. I have certain people that I just sometimes don't have the faith will come to Jesus or are unreachable. I'm no different than these people in these crowds. Do you have a family member that you think is beyond being reachable?
Well, you worry that they've had so many opportunities.
Yeah.
And they know the story. And grew up in the South and grew up in the Baptist church, but you just don't see the evidence of
That's true.
them receiving and making a change. And so you worry that
they're unreachable. And then
you can get discouraged praying for remember your family or friends year after year after year to come to Christ. But you can't give up.
what about coworkers? You ever had a coworker
Yes.
that just irritates the snot out of you? But yet this person needs Jesus so badly. But it's almost like you don't even want to witness to them, because then you'd have to act different around them. You don't want to invite them to church because you don't like being around them at work. You sure don't want them at church because they're obnoxious. We all have people like that. I work with some. It's really a pain in the butt. They seem like they make their goal in life to make my life difficult. I'm just being blunt. And yeah. What about the guy that you see it's always at the same intersection? Is. But here's the deal, though. At some point, all those people we just mentioned, what's to say they don't have an interest in Jesus at some moment in their life? That person that's obnoxious at work, what if at some point they have a spiritual interest in Jesus, And what if at that moment we miss it because we just a jerk right back to them? You know, you want to be a jerk? I'll play the jerk. I'll show you what a jerk can be. In that moment, we miss that spiritual interest they had. And it's just like the guy who tried to come to church without a mask. They're turned away because of our testimony. Or we just think they're not reachable. They're not worth investing the time in. And Zacchaeus was that person. He was that person. But all that was about to change. Zacchaeus wouldn't be the jerk anymore to these people. He was going to be a very different person. God was going to change him from the inside out. And in Luke verse in 19:8, it says, and after it says that Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, be Lord, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor. And if I've taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I will restore it fourfold. Now what we're not given here, we're not privy to the actual conversation that happens at this house between Zacchaeus and Jesus. We don't know what's actually said, but whatever it was that was said was life-changing because what we do know is what he says afterwards. And let's be clear that verse 8, Zacchaeus is 180 here, where he all of a sudden, instead of being greedy, he wants to give half of his goods to the poor. This isn't because he's trying to obtain a salvation. This isn't because Jesus directed him to do this. This isn't because of a feeling of guilt. This is the evidence of salvation. This is what you do. As we've taught through Luke, we've seen this time and time again. When people come to know Christ, this is what happens. This is the natural reaction and result of salvation. But consider what Zacchaeus is doing here. It says here, we can just gloss over it by reading this. Zacchaeus says, behold, Lord, half of my goods I'm going to give to the poor. Think about that. So that's like you taking a piece of paper today, a piece of paper, and listing all your assets from your house to your IRAs, to your 401ks, to your mutual funds, to your property that you own, to gold and silver you got in your box, or to guns, or whatever you got, listing all your assets, coming up with a number, and then saying, all right, I'm going to liquidate, and half of it I'm going to donate to ministries. I'm giving it to the poor. Pretty big. That's what he did. You're like, well, he's wealthy. He can afford it. Still, it's pretty big. But that wasn't all that he did. He then makes up a list of every single person that he has defrauded, that he has done wrong when he was a tax collector, all the years that he's done it. He's not only going to pay them back. Now, this is out of his pocket. Out of his pocket, he's going to pay this. All the money that he took, and fourfold, times 4. That's pretty big. I mean, it's going to be a pretty big hit to his wealth. It's no small amount. This is the result of his salvation. And verse 9, Jesus says, this day, salvation's come to this house. You know, a few weeks back, we read the story of the lost chapter, we call it, where there was something lost, you know, and the one I love is the one of the lost sheep, where the man has 100 sheep, but he's missing one. What does he do? He leaves the 99 and goes and looks for the one that's lost. Now we would say, we'd play spiritual triage there. We'd say, well, wait a minute. I mean, that sheep, he made his own bed. He's going to have to sleep in it. You know, you made choices, buddy. I'm staying with the 99. These are God's people. I mean, this is where it's at right here. These are God's folks. That guy, he decided to go out on his own. Jesus said, no, I've come to seek and save that which is lost. And he leaves the 99 and goes out and looks for it. And Zacchaeus is the 99. What does he do? He leaves the crowd. He leaves the 99 still outside. And he goes into the 99 to the 100 because he's seeking and saving that which is lost.
You know, I forgot where it's at. It talks about Jesus being a friend of sinners. And I'm so thankful for this friend.
Me too.
Talking about that love, going after that, the one that goes astray. Thankful for that.
Me too. And as we live in these last days, our mandate is to seek that 100th, to seek the one that's lost. Even if it means that we have to leave the 99. You know, we have to make sacrifices. That's what the missionaries have done. They've left the 99 and are out and seeking to save. I'm not saying that's all what we should do, but there's ways we can do that and apply that to our own life, where we go out and we sacrifice looking for that 99th. It's also worth remembering that this man is least likely to be a follower of Christ. If this was the man who was the least likely that you would think would be the follower of Christ, yet that's the one Jesus was looking for. And we need to remember that there are people that are the outcasts, the people that we think are least likely to make us have a spiritual difference. You know, it's just like the guy who's trying to, Napoleon, trying to decide which ones are actually going to be useful to me in my army to fight. I don't want to be the person that makes that decision. Would you? Like, if you're in pain and you're hurting from an injury, do you want to be that person? I don't want to have to, if one guy's pain and another guy's pain, there's a difference, yes, but both of them are in pain. I don't want to be the one that has to decide which one I address. Thank God I don't have to spiritually. We don't have to ignore the one that we think is beyond reach or can't be useful in God's army, so to speak, and can't make a difference. We need to be sensitive to Holy Spirit in those moments to know that's the Zacchaeus in our life. That's the outcast. That's the one that the general church doesn't have any interest in. We overlook them. The person who may be holding up a gay pride flag. It's got the BLM stuff. Everything that gets under our goat, gets under our skin. That's the Zacchaeuses. Well, you want to say something, Ken? No, I sensed you wanted to say something. Yeah, Antifa. One last thing I want to say about Zacchaeus. Do you know what the name Zacchaeus means? It means pure one. It means clean, righteous, innocent. Zacchaeus did not live that life prior to this moment. But it got me thinking about Zacchaeus when his mama named him that. If you know about Hebrew names that were assigned to Jewish people, they typically lived out their names a lot. It's weird how that worked, But Zacchaeus didn't. Not initially. Makes you wonder if Zacchaeus' mama didn't pray that he would eventually live out the meaning of his name. And he would. He would be the pure one, the righteous one. Which goes to show that God still changes folks. Even if you're named with a name where it's associated with something God can change you. He did it then and he still does it today. Isn't that a good story? So we got to look for the Zacchaeuses in our life. The ones that we think aren't worth wasting time on. Thank God Jesus doesn't see it that way. That's a good story, isn't it? I enjoyed studying it this week. Any other thoughts or comments?
Kevin?
Yes, sir.
My experience, and I'm sure you would agree, some of the most difficult people to win to Christ are religious people. The publicans, the tax collectors, knew without a doubt that they were sinners. They weren't known for being deeply religious. They knew that they were out cheating people. They always would ask for more, not always, but I think typically it was common that they were cheats, and they would tell people that their tax is a certain amount and then they would keep the difference. And this was a common practice we don't like tax collectors either. I think if you got a letter in the mail this week saying you were going to be audited, you wouldn't look forward to it. And so, the people that are hardest to win are religious people. Remember what the Bible says in John 7, about verse 48, they said, neither did the Pharisees believe on him. They used that as an excuse. They said, well, listen, if the Pharisees don't believe on him, why should we, the common people? But the Pharisees were self-righteous. They were religious, and they're the hardest people to win. You know, it's hard to win a Jehovah's Witness. It's hard to win a Mormon. It's hard to win a Catholic, but it's not as hard to witness to and maybe win someone who's worn out with sin. They're just out and out, common, ordinary, sinful people that are ripe and ready. Usually religious people are the most difficult and challenging to win. Not that they can't be saved. There were Pharisees that got saved. We know that. Look at Saul of Tarsus. But we just need to keep praying for them and not give up. It just so happens that some of these people that are great sinners, eventually, if they're witnessed to, are often ripe for the picking and ready to get saved if you speak to them about Christ and do it faithfully. But they're, I think, a little bit easier to convince. I mean, the first step, what do they tell you when you witness this? They try to train you to be a witness at your church. They say the first thing you have to do is convince them that they're a sinner. If you can't convince them they're lost, they're not going to see their need to be saved. So who's the easiest to convince that they're sinners, but someone who's just out and out living in the sins of the world? A religious person doesn't view themselves as being a sinner. They're already okay because they're good and self-righteous. Okay, very good lesson, son.
Thanks, Dad.
I'd like to give an example.
Okay, sure.
Just said, and you know, everybody that accepts Christ has a testimony, and they're all good. Every one of them. Some of them is, you know, I went forward when I was 7 years old, and I accepted Christ and lived this incredible Christian life ever since. But it's the stories where somebody was killing themselves, and they've gone through, you know, drug and alcohol, divorces, and suicide attempts, that we gravitate towards those. And my oldest son, had a good friend in high school. He was a superstar football player, great wide receiver, on his way to college. But he fight everybody, he was angry, and for some reason, one night, he was driving past like a Waffle House. And there was an old man there, and he had said something, and he jumped out of his car, might have been headlocking him, took a lighter and burned his hair. And so a couple days later, the police caught him, and he went to prison for 12 years. And here's a guy that would have, he hadn't even graduated high school, but he was 18, right as an adult. And so he goes to prison, and he's this angry young man. And somebody in there knew that he needed Jesus Christ. And over time, he accepted Christ. And his name is Zach Myers. And Zach said to Amy and I, he said, I have the most freedom I ever had in my life was in prison. He said, yeah, I might have been behind bars every night, because the freedom that I found in Christ, and he became a different person. And to this day, he's got a wife and 2 kids. They're in church every Sunday, and he is the nicest, kindest, most compassionate person you'll ever meet. And those are the kind that I shouldn't say they're easy to reach, but they're prime for the picking.
Yeah.
And then we've got another friend who, he is a, you know, prior military, or he's retired military. I used to work alongside him. He believes every conservative value you could think of. He gets on these debates on Facebook. He's polite. He's everything you would think, and go, that guy has to know Jesus. But I've known him for over 20 years now, and he's an atheist. And he is so hard to reach because he just doesn't want to take that leap of faith to come to know Christ. But if you get into science, you realize it takes more faith these days because of everything we know about DNA to believe that there is no God, which is a good thing. And we've been trying to reach him for over 20 years. Anyway, I love that guy's testimony, Zach Lyons.
That is cool.
Who never felt freer in his whole life than when he was in prison. because he came in our class.
And don't always find yourself have to be ready for those moments when somebody shows that spiritual interest. I've noticed this on this particular route that I'm on right now, where I deliver down on the South Side. You know, I think pretty much everybody knows I'm a Christian, and it's just, I'm glad they do, but sometimes it's that one moment where I'm at the busiest, or there's so much going on in my mind, stress, and it's that moment they show spiritual interest. And they ask me, "Hey, I need to ask you a question." Whoa, my mind's not there right now, you know? But that's why we have to put on the whole armor of God to be ready for those moments. And Holy Spirit is going to put us in a position to be that witness that we need to be in that moment. And more and more that's happened in these last months, where I had people ask me questions, and I just got to be ready, you know? There's Zacchaeuses are everywhere. They're showing interest. People are still showing interest in Jesus. They still are. And we've just got to be ready, as Jesus says, seek to save the lost. I love you guys. Hope you have a great week. We'll continue our study in Luke next week as we make our way to the cross. That's where we're headed, okay? Hope you have a great week. Love y'all. See y'all. Good to see you, Dad. Reggie, Donna, good to see you. See you, Miss Cheryl.